Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm here with a new video. Today's video is super exciting, although maybe not really for the people that don't sew, but as you can maybe tell from the background here, today is the release day for the Aimee bag, which has now been renamed to the Quilted Star bag. So this video is the tutorial of how to sew this bag. And I do want to quickly kind of mention all of the new views that it has, a little bit about the materials that you will use, and of course all of the bags that I made and that are here. So the previous Aimee bag came in 3 sizes, whilst the current bag actually comes in 4 sizes. So it goes from an extra small to a large. And it also comes with a worksheet, so you can make your own bag pattern. So you can just find a quilt motif online or something that is already in your pattern library and then build from that and make your own pattern. Which means you can basically make this bag in any size you would like. So you can make something really small or something really large, whatever fits your needs. Then the previous version did have a few different closure options. The current version only has 2 closure options, which I will show you. So here we have closure option 1, which is just this extra fabric detail, which was not included in the previous pattern, but this is something that I always put on my bags when I sell bags. So I feel like this was something that was really necessary in a pattern. So it just looks like this, and it's a really fun way to play around with the fabric. So as you can see here, we have a quilt block that doesn't include this fabric. And then we have some block print on the back, but then a gingham fabric closure. So it's just a really fun way where you can add an additional fabric into the bag and just make something really fun and scrappy. And then here we have a bag with closure option 2, which I kind of refer to as a scrunch closure, because when you cinch it up, it kind of creates this drawstring effect. And then you can just open it like this. So it's in the same fabric, as you can tell. So the fabric kind of just continues to the top. So it's a little bit different and it's a little bit more neutral. So those are the 2 closure options. Now the previous pattern came with 1 quilt block, which was a sawtooth star. This pattern doesn't include the sawtooth star because I feel like it's a little bit more basic, so I wanted to do something different. So instead of a sawtooth star, we have a crystal star, which I do have here as well. So this is how the crystal star looks. It's basically the sawtooth star, but with just a little extra diamond fabric in the center. So that's really cute. So that is one of the options. Then we also have an Ohio star, which can actually be made in 2 versions. So this is a regular Ohio star. And then here we have a split Ohio star, which just creates a really different look, but it is really fun. It uses almost the exact same pattern pieces, and the instructions are also almost the same. But keep in mind that for the split Ohio star, there are only instructions in this video and not in the pattern. Then something a little bit more simple, we have a checkerboard block. So this is the checkerboard. It's just a little bit more beginner friendly and you only use squares, of course. So I really like this one for beginners, as well as the crystal star. I would say those are the most beginner friendly. And then still within the theme of the checkerboard, we also have a checkerboard star. So this one has checkerboards in the corner, but then a star in the center. So you kind of get the best of both worlds in this block. A little bit more difficult, but definitely still very doable. So this is actually one of my favorites. And the most difficult block out of all of these is the Love in the Mist, which is this one. This one has kind of a look of a sawtooth star within another star motif. So it's a really fun one, but I would say this one is the size large, and the smaller you go for this block, the more difficult it will probably be, because you're just working with quite small pieces for these corners, for example. And I do rate this one like a 4 out of 5 difficulty, but also don't be alarmed by that. I just rate that difficulty because we just have a lot of points to match up. So basically here you have these corners that consist of 4 pieces, and you have to match up those points like on both sides. So there's just a little bit more going on, but I would still say that is a very doable block, and it's a super fun one as well. So those are the 5 blocks that are now in a pattern. And then we also have new pocket options. One thing I really wanted to add to this pattern was actually a zipper pocket. And I managed to make a zipper pocket that is really fun and really playful. I'm going to show you the sample that is the most colorful, basically. And that is actually this one. So this is of course in the lining, so it's just like a little flap. It has a plastic zipper and then also the notions clip attached to it. And here you can see that I really played around with different fabrics and different trims, because you also have some decorative trim on the top. So you can play around with it and kind of match it to your block in the front, which, you know, we both have those in the pink fabric. But you can also go for something more neutral. So for example, in this bag, I also added the pocket with the zipper, but it's just a lot more neutral. And we did it in the same background fabric, just added a brown zip and then a fun white, like a decorative trim. So it's kind of neutral. That is just another option that you can do. So I just really love adding like all of these little options, and you can just have a lot of fun and play around with fabrics and scraps, which I just think is like the magic of sewing and quilting in general, is that you get to just use up small pieces of fabric. So that is one of the pockets that you can do on the inside. Then we also have a long pocket. So this is pocket 1. I sometimes refer to it as a long and divided pocket because that's literally what it is. I'm just gonna put this bag towards the inside out. It just looks like this. Like it's basically goes throughout the entire length, and then you can divide it into compartments. So this one is divided into 2 because it's a smaller bag. But for the larger sizes, sometimes I just divide it in like a bunch of small compartments, like for needles. But you can also do something larger like this, because there is another thing that you can use for needles, which is a pocket on the outside. This one I mostly recommend for view B, which I have not even gone into view A and view B, but hold up. There is, okay, I need to take a step back, but we have view A, which is a rectangular bag, and view B, which is a circular bag, which was also how it was in the previous pattern. So I kept that the same. I'm actually holding view B right now, so as you can see, it is more of a circle, and the base of it is actually a circle as well. And then most of the bags that I've shown you here are view A, the rectangle, because that is my favorite. So you can see that when it's gonna stand up, it just forms a rectangle on the bottom, like this. So it's just a little bit different, 2 different options. But this particular pocket for the outside I recommend for view B, because it's just a little bit nicer when it goes like in a curve rather than in a box shape. Because this is a pocket that is really nice for needles. So it is a long pocket that I've divided into little compartments. For example, a stitch holder, and you can just pop that in and then it will look like this, which I just think is really cute. So you have a pocket on the inside and on the outside, so it's just extra convenient. And then there is one more pocket that you can do on the outside, which I then suggest for view A, which is then the rectangle. So they both have a pocket option for the outside, but you could easily put this on the view B, the circular one as well. So it just looks like this. It's just a really small little pocket that I've done here in the same fabric, so it's a little bit difficult to tell, and it's perfect for notions. So I add a little bit of Velcro on the top, so you can just pull it open like this, and then you just have a little pocket that you can put like small things in, like a measuring tape or like cable needles, etc. So you can just play around with all of the different pocket options. A lot of the testers also decided to put 2 pockets on the inside, so the zipper pocket as well as the long divided pocket, because the long divided pocket kind of allows for bigger tools and needles, whilst the zipper pocket then allows for things that you don't want to lose, like small stitch markers, or maybe like a label, or maybe you found some money on the floor, I don't know, like small things, and they're not going to go anywhere. And then naturally, as if these weren't enough options for the pattern, I did add some hacks at the end of this video as well. So one of the first hacks is actually for the ruffle option on the top, which is only possible for this specific closure option. So it doesn't work if you want to do this closure option, that doesn't work. So just keep that in mind, but it's a really fun little addition that you can do just to make it, yeah, like give it a little pizzazz, basically. Then I also show you how to make half triangle squares that look like this. And these are really fun because it's a super simple like little quilt motif that you can do, and that you can basically build into anything. So I will put some inspiration pictures on the screen, but I kind of went for this, like whilst just playing around with all of the fabrics, thought this was really cute. So this is my Christmas bag. And this one is also completely quilted, so I actually gave it some pink quilting on the front and on the back. So for this one I used non-fusible batting, which after this I will go into the supplies, but that is another option if you don't want to use fusible batting, or if it's not available to you. This will be also explained at the end on how to do this, but you do have to quilt it unless you use a glue spray. And then I also added another closure option just for the hack part of this video, which is this extra fabric closure detail, which can kind of stand up on its own, but you can also just pop that to the inside, and it just makes the bag even more spacious. So if the bag you made is not spacious enough already, then you could add this. Do keep in mind that you have to lengthen the top of this a little bit, so that will also be explained of course at the end. But I really like this option, and this is then a bag that I made based on the worksheet. So this is my own measurements, just based on the block that I put on the front of it. So it's kind of long and narrow, but I think it's really fun. And it definitely looks almost like a Santa's Christmas bag or something. Then I do want to briefly mention the sizes as well that are already in the pattern for those that don't want to, well, make their own sizes. Here we have the extra small, which I would recommend for socks and really small projects. So currently this is holding 2 skeins of 50 grams like DK weight or fingering weight yarn, which fits in there very nicely. Then the next size up from that is the size small, so I have it here in view B, and then I have another one in size small in view A, so you can see those sizes. And this is more for like a small shawl or the beginning of a slipover, or when you know you're not going to carry out basically your entire amount of yarn, because sometimes you might go somewhere, so maybe like the beginning of a sweater could also fit in here as long as you don't bring the entire sweater quantity with you. Then we have the size medium, of which I only have made one, and this one fits about 8 balls of 50 grams DK weight yarn, so it's almost a sweater quantity. And then we have 2 sizes large as well, so I have view B again and then view A, which this one fits a lot of yarn. This is definitely the sweater quantity bag for most people. So currently this is holding multiple balls of mohair and also over 8 balls of 50 grams DK weight yarn. So you could easily carry your entire sweater quantity in this bag. And of course keep in mind that the project still needs to fit in there as well. And if you're not happy with the size, like I said, you can use the worksheet and just make it a little bit bigger. Because for the size large, if you use the largest quilt block like I have here, there is not really much of a border. So some testers prefer it with a bigger border, so you could just add that, which you can also see here. So this is also the size large Ohio block on the size large bag, and there's barely a border. All of the materials that you need to make these bags are of course listed in the pattern, but I do want to quickly show you some of the materials in a little bit more detail. So first of all, we have the fusible batting. Like I said, during the test I found that this is maybe not as easily as available to most people as I thought it was. So in the Netherlands, and I think most of Europe, there's a brand called Vlieseline. It's a German brand and they make a fusible type of batting. So actually I am able to purchase this from Amazon, but you may not. But it kind of looks like this. It's a little bit more of a flat batting, so it's quite thin, as you can kind of see like this. And then it has a glue side, so you can see that this is a little bit textured. So that is actually the glue that you can just iron this on a bag, and then it of course sticks. And that way you don't actually have to quilt the entire bag. So most of these bags are made with a fusible batting and they don't have any quilting on the front or on the back. So this specific Vlieseline is called Vlieseline H640. So I do really recommend, if you have this available to you, to just try it out, and you don't need that much. You can just see if you like it, and I think it's a really big game changer. But if you don't have this available to you, or you just want to use up what you have, like your stash or whatever the reason, you can also use non-fusible batting. So here I have just regular polyester batting. This is 200 grams per square meter, which is how they do it in the Netherlands. Like they say the amount of grams that is a batting. I don't know how it works in other countries, because I do believe, for example, in the US, they sometimes refer to it as a high loft or low loft batting. So I would classify this one more as a high loft because it is quite thick. So you could use this, and I do recommend, like I also showed in the video tutorial, to just leave a border if you are going to use this, because you have to quilt this in order for it to not move anymore. So you do want to leave just a little bit of a border, because the quilting is going to make it smaller. And if you just don't want to quilt, but you want to use your non-fusible batting, I suggest using a quilter's like glue spray like this. So this is the Odiv 505, and this is just a temporary adhesive. It works really well also to just stabilize things when things are moving too much and you are quilting. This is still something that I really recommend having in your collection of sewing supplies, because it does make all of the difference. And then of course, to make the bags you also need fabric. I recommend just using cotton. Honestly, cotton just works really well for this bag, but you can also use linen. I've even personally made some bags with wool, corduroy. And then for the quilt motifs on the front, I do think quilter's cotton is the best. So quilter's cotton that you buy in a quilt store is of higher quality. Usually the fabric is more dense, so it just allows for basically quilting to be much easier and much nicer and more crisp. They are generally a little bit more expensive as well, so that is something to keep in mind. And still, it is definitely not absolutely necessary. Like a lot of these fabrics are just regular fabric from the fabric store, like this is just a cotton poplin, etc. It's just something that you can play around with. For example, here I do have a basket full of basically fat quarters is what they call it. So it's a piece that is like a quarter of a yard or a meter, like roughly around that size, of course, because like a meter is not a yard, basically. So they are just little squares like this. And usually the prints are also much smaller than in regular fabrics, because in quilting you obviously use small pieces of fabric. So a small print like this is just going to show up much nicer than a large print. And then the final little thing to note about this pattern that I just want to mention in this video tutorial, because it's kind of too much to add to the pattern as written text, but that is that it's very common in quilting to measure everything in inches. Therefore, in this pattern specifically, I'm only mentioning the measurements for the quilt motifs and in the worksheet in inches. And I know that's really tricky for a lot of people that are metric or European or wherever you live and you use the metric system. I myself am from the Netherlands, so I know your issue, because I also measure everything in centimeters. So it is just a little bit like a knot, like a, I don't know, like a switch that you have to turn in your head to kind of get used to it more. But I highly recommend it, because the tools, the patterns, basically almost everything that you're gonna come across for quilting is gonna have inches. So that's why I'm trying to kind of get you acquainted to this way of measuring things, because measuring in inches for a quilt block is much more accurate and much nicer than measuring millimeters. Just trust me on that. Some testers were a little bit confused about that, so I did just want to quickly mention that in the video as well. So I think those were the only little things that I had to note before we can get started with the tutorial. If you do have any questions for me, do leave them in the comments. Now for the release, you can actually also get the pattern today with a 20% discount, so that will be linked in the description as well. Thank you all so much for watching, and let's get started with the tutorial. Now here we are at the sewing machine, and we're ready to attach all of our pieces to create an Ohio star. First of all, we don't need the squares right at this moment. So I'm going to take the squares that we cut and just put them to the side. Then I kind of like to lay out how I'm making my Ohio star. So this is my main fabric, which is going to be on the top. This is going to be that contrasting fabric, which we have the most of, which is going to be like this. And then this is going to be our printed fabric. So I'm going to be starting by basically sewing these two together like that. And then these two as well. So you're going to take a triangle from each, put them on top of each other with the right sides touching or together. Put that underneath your sewing machine. But first I do like to swap out my foot for a foot that has a 1/4 inch of seam allowance, which looks a little bit different. But here you can see the regular sewing foot, and this is a 1/4 inch seam allowance, which is regular seam allowance in quilting. And then we're going to sew this. And then here you can see that I've reached the end. Then I will just grab the next piece, put those together in the exact same way. You want to be careful to not suddenly basically sew this like this in a different direction, because then when it's folded open, it's not going to be the same anymore. Then I like to break the thread, just like this. And then it can be helpful to just open up these pieces and just get a little reminder of how that is going to look. So this is going to be folded open like this, and then this piece is going to sit right opposite like that. So we know by that we have to fold this piece in this direction. So they have to be on top of each other again with the right sides touching. So just gonna move those away. And then again sewing all of those pieces 4 times with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And what I'm doing here by not cutting basically the thread in between all of these pieces is called chain stitching, which is a very common technique in quilting. And then those triangles are done as well. Now I'm going to take this to the ironing board, and we're going to iron everything with the seams open. You can either iron everything with the seams open, or you can fold them in the opposite direction, because they will be sewn together, basically like this. But I just prefer my seams open this way. Now we're back at the sewing machine with our 2 pieces. So this is how we're going to sew them together. Just putting most of those aside and then grabbing one of each. So those are going to be sewn together like this. Just going to flip it over, put it right sides together. Now you can use a pin in between these seams if you like, but I usually don't use any pins when I'm quilting because it just saves a lot of time when you don't. Then I'm gonna sew this seam entirely from one edge to the other. And just as before, I will grab the next two pieces, flip those over and put them on top of each other. Now we're back at our ironing board, just as before. Going to clip all of these pieces separate from each other. So now we have 4, and I'm just going to fold them open and then again fold this seam open again with my fingers and press it with my iron. So here we have our half triangle squares, and I'm going to put the ruler down and I'm actually going to trim them to be 4.5 inches. So I have here 2.25 inch from that center, and I'm going to cut. Then I'm going to turn it all the way around. Measure 4.5 from that edge that I just cut and cut again. So this edge is now 4.5 inches. Flip it again and repeat that process. So I am measuring now 2.25. You want to put the ruler as straight as possible along those edges. And then measure 4.5 again and cut that. And this creates a really beautiful, perfectly sized half triangle squares. Then this is going to be our fabric layout, and I'm going to take that to the sewing machine so we can work them row by row. So here's the first row, just putting that one aside, the next row, and then this is going to be our first row. So basically what I like to do is take that centerpiece, just fold that on top of the next one with right sides touching, and then we're going to sew this edge with 1/4 of a seam allowance. Then I like to take that next row and just put those pieces aside, and I'm going to sew again those first 2 pieces together. Third column that is just patiently waiting here. Again, put that one there. This is going to be just exactly like that. Once it's sewn together, put those on top of each other with the right sides touching. So here we have those 3 rows already sewn up, and we're going to attach those final pieces. Again, put those on top of each other with the right sides together and sew. For that middle piece, you really want to make sure that it's sitting correctly. So you want those fabrics to be opposite of each other and touching that centerpiece. And then this is how that looks. Here we have those 3 rows sewn together. Now you can either go to the ironing board and iron, which is recommended if you're a beginner, but I like to just flip these over and align those seams so that they're in the opposite direction. And then put that underneath the sewing machine. Again, sewing that with 1/4 inch of seam allowance. And then when you flip that open, this is how that will look. And it looks really nice and clean. So now we can just repeat that for that bottom row. But here you just want to make sure that you're working that seam allowance in the same direction. So here you can see that this seam allowance is folded to the right side. So now it's also going to be to the right side, which means that that other seam allowance on the bottom is in the opposite direction. And then your Ohio star is actually finished. So we can take this to the ironing board, press all of those seams open. So it's just going to be these long seams that we're going to press open. Now I'm going to show you how to make the split Ohio star. So here we have the exact same pieces in 2 different fabrics. So we have bigger triangles and smaller triangles for both of those fabrics, and then these 2 corners. So those 2 corners, we don't have to do anything with those right now, so I will just put those to the side. Then we're going to sew together the bigger triangles, and we need 3 of these pieces, so you will have 1 of each left over, which you can just keep as scraps or to make another block. And we're going to put these together, right sides touching. So we're going to sew 3 of these, and we're going to sew this edge with a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And then whilst I'm at the sewing machine, I'm also going to start sewing the smaller triangles, 4 little triangles together. And these we are trimming down, so they will be larger when they are finished before we are trimming them. So they will be sewn like this. So here we are just placing those on top of each other. And we will make 4 in total. So I just like to basically arrange all of the pieces before I start sewing them. So we're going to sew these long edges of the bigger triangles, and then these short straight edges, and these as well, all with a 1/4 of an inch of seam allowance. So here we have the 3 bigger triangles, which we will take to the ironing board and press open these seams. So I can just put those to the side, and then we have that long chain of all of these triangle pieces, and we're just going to cut those. And then we can get started to sew them all together. So basically how this works is you will have one piece like this, and then you want the seam allowance to always be in the same direction, so either to the printed fabric, so the right side or the left side. I'm just choosing the left side right now. You can either finger press this, take it to the iron, or use a seam roller like this, which is also quite nice. And then we will put a piece on top, just like this. And those fabrics need to be in the opposite direction. So up above a pink one is a yellow one, and vice versa. Besides trimming these pieces, I'm also trimming those half triangle squares. And I'm making the size medium, so my squares need to be 3 inch and a 1/4, which as you can see they are a tiny bit bigger. So I just line it up with the edge, then trim one side. And then you can see here that you have this extra bit of seam allowance, which is then trimmed off. Putting this to measure 3 inch and a 1/4. And then that is our finished square. So here we have 3 of those. So they are now the exact same measurement as those other squares, as you can see. And now we need to repeat that for these. So here the process is a little bit different. So we're using this as our center point. And these, like I said, they need to be 3 inch and a 1/4. So from this measurement, I'm actually going to be measuring half of that from this center point, which 3 inches and a 1/4 is a little bit of an odd measurement. Then I will trim this. Then I will turn it towards the other side, line this straight edge up with my cutting mat, then measure 3 inch and a 1/4. Then again lining up that center and trimming this. And then repeating that same process. So I'm lining this up with my cutting mat, marking 3 and a 1/4. And then that is our finished piece. And as you can see, it is exactly the same size. So I'm going to repeat that for the other 3 squares, and then we will assemble everything together. This is going to be the layout for our split Ohio star. So we have those bigger half triangles that we trimmed down, and then those smaller half triangle pieces that we also trimmed down. So I like to sew basically in columns, so I like to keep the 3rd column separate there. And then I'm going to start with that 1st column. Then I'm just going to flip all of these pieces over so that the right sides are touching. And then we're going to sew all of these seams with a 1/4 of an inch of seam allowance. And I like to do that by chain stitching, so we're not going to cut any threads. So here column 1 and column 2 is attached together. We can just fold these open to see how it is looking, especially that one in the center is quite important. You want to have these seams really nicely matched up, which I think that is quite decent. And now we can get started to attach that final column. So I think that first piece and put it on top of that one in the center. So these are the most important pieces, like anywhere where you have 2 pieces that are split on top of each other. So these are pieces where it is nice to put a pin in it. Now when you fold all of these open, you can see that it starts to look a bit like the finished block. And we just have these 2 rows left to finish. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut these threads so that they are separate. Now you can either take this to the ironing board and press these seams, or you can immediately start sewing. If you're a beginner, it is recommended to iron this, but I'm gonna go ahead and sew it already. Now I have these seams here that are pointing towards the center. Then I'm going to place that top piece right on top, right sides together. And these seams are going in the opposite direction, so they are pointing outwards rather than towards the inside. So then you can fold this open and just see how that looks, if you think that looks nice and neat, or if you have to redo something. So here we have those first 2 rows attached, and then we're going to attach that final row. Be very careful to not accidentally turn this around, basically, so that those basic blocks are above each other like this. It really needs to be like this, so they are going in a diagonal line like that. And then sew this. Now I'm going to be showing you how to sew the crystal star. So here we have that center. This is fabric D, and this is basically going to be like this once it's finished. So we're going to take our next fabric, which this is fabric C. So we have 4 of these little squares, and you would basically just put those on top like this. Then I like to take a ruler and a water erasable fabric pen and just put that on top and basically align the ruler with those points. So we are creating a little triangle, and then I will mark that line. And that is actually going to be our first sewing line. And you can do 2 at a time. So you can also put one in the opposite corner. And then these are the 2 first lines that we're going to sew, just right across. Then you're going to take your fabric scissors, and we're actually going to trim this. And we're going to leave 1/4 of an inch of seam allowance. And then as we're sewing those second triangles, the first ones actually need to be folded open already. And you can see here that if you do fold open that seam allowance after you've sewn it, then you get a really nice and straight edge. And if you forget to fold open that seam of the first triangles before sewing the second triangles, you will kind of get a weird seam like this. Next up, we are going to make the flying geese. So we are using the rectangles and fabric B squares. This is a different method for the flying geese than is used in the checkerboard stars. This is a method where you put the squares on top of the rectangle, just like this. Then we use our ruler again, and then we mark out this line. And we're going to repeat that 4 times. So for each rectangle, we're just starting out with 1 square. And we're going to take each of these to the sewing machine and then sew these lines, and then we're going to press them. Again, I'm using my little tool to cut all of these threads. Then you're going to trim this with 1/4 of an inch of seam allowance. And we're trimming away that corner. So you don't want to be trimming basically the big piece of the rectangle that is left, but just this little triangle corner. And then we're going to press this in this direction. So now we have 4 of these pieces that already have that fabric attached, and we're going to go back and put the other squares on top and then repeat that process by marking that line and sewing it. Now we have 4 finished flying geese, and we can get started assembling all of this together. So this is going to form the points of the star. So they are placed like this. And then this background fabric is just our corners. And we're going to sew it together just like this. And then I always like to sew in columns. So this is the last column. Then first I sew these 2 pieces together, then in a chain stitch. So those 2 and then these 2. And then we will attach those. So here we have those first 2 top pieces, and I'm going to put those on top of each other with the right sides together, and then sew this with 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Then we have our centerpiece, and that star that's going to be like this. I'm going to put this on top of that flying geese. And this is one where you really want to make sure that you're sewing over this part where those seams are meeting, both in the front and in the back, because that is going to create the best shape. And then that bottom piece again, putting this on top with the right side stitching. You can see that this one is facing in the opposite direction. So we have column 1 and column 2 attached together. Then we're going to finish this with column 3, put that on top of each other with the right side stitching. Here, make sure that that flying geese is in the correct direction, so it's not basically like this, but we have some nice stars, and put that on top of each other. And then you can open it up and just see how you've sewn it together. You can see that I did not sew this very neatly, so sometimes I will just go back and kind of take apart my stitching here, which I will do now for you. And then I'm just gonna re-sew that center. And then here you can see that that's a lot better than how I previously did it. And now we can get started to sew the rows together. So I'm going to clip these seams, and then we're going to start with that middle row. Now you can either take this to the ironing board first and just iron all of these seams in the opposite direction, but I like to just go immediately towards the sewing machine and then iron everything later. So you want these seams, like I said, to be in the opposite direction. So here we have that top row sewn. Just gonna turn this around and then repeat that for the bottom row. And here you want to make sure that those seams are going in the same direction. So you can see here that that center piece is actually going towards the inside. So here I want it to be towards the inside as well. So this corner is actually going towards the outside. Then open it up and you can see basically you're sewing and see if anything needs to be changed. I'm quite happy with this. So I'm going to take this to the ironing board and press open these two seams. And then this crystal star is finished. Next, I'm going to be showing you how to sew the checkerboard. So we have 6 of these squares, then we have 8 of the pink, then we have 4 of the bigger ones, and then 6 again of these. And we need to combine them together. So I'm going to take 2 of each of the purple one, and we are going to combine those with some pink. They need to be in the opposite direction of each other, just like this. And we're gonna sew those together. So you're going to take 2 pieces. So this is fabric D, and this is fabric B. We're going to put those on top of each other, and we're going to sew it with 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to switch my foot. I'm just going to chain stitch. So I am not breaking the yarn. I'm immediately lifting up my presser foot once I finish the first one, bringing the next one under and sewing it. So now we have 4 of these little squares that are chained together. I'm going to use my little cutting tool to separate them. So now they are all separated, and now we're going to sew them together. Now you can take this to the iron and press these seams towards the opposite direction, but for quick and easy we're going to use a little seam roller, and you need to press them in the opposite direction. And also, of course, remember that we don't want 2 purple blocks underneath each other. So here I am just pressing that seam down on the pink fabric. I will turn it around and also press it towards the pink fabric. Then you can put those on top of each other, and those seams need to be in the opposite direction, just like that. And then we're going to sew this with 1/4 inch of seam allowance. And then we're going to repeat that for the other one. And then when you open those up, you will have your first checkerboard squares that are finished. So they will look like this. And then I will press this seam open at the ironing board. So we have 2 of these. Next we're going to make some more, but with a different fabric pairing. So now we're going to pair the 4 remaining pink ones that we have. We are going to pair those with the yellow fabric. And then the remaining 2 yellow ones are going to go with the remaining 2 lilac ones. And you're going to repeat the steps that you just did. So just sewing them together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to be repeating this until we have basically 5 of these. And then I will meet you back here and we will assemble everything together. So this is going to be our final layout. I like to always just lay out the pieces. I will sew those 2 together. Then I will sew those, and then I will attach the last column. So I put those pieces there so I know which direction they need to be faced. And then I have these 2 ready. And this is the center, so this one needs to be on top of this one. And we're going to sew this short edge with a 1/4 inch of seam allowance. Then we take our final column, starting with the first one. So this is gonna go here. Put that on top of each other, right sides touching. And again, sew it. And then when you open it, you can kind of already see what your block is going to look like. We just need to finish these last 2 rows to sew it together. First I'm going to sew the top row to the middle row. So we put them on top of each other. And here you want to make sure that those seam allowances are actually going in the opposite direction. So you can iron this beforehand if that's easier for you. But I like to just put them on top of each other and just start sewing. So here we have the top row and the center row, and we just have to attach this bottom row. So I flip this on top of this. And here you want to make sure that those previous seams are still facing the direction that we chose. So basically this is facing to the left, so the one in the back needs to face to the right. And then this is our finished quilt block. Now I'm going to take this over to the ironing board and I'm just going to press these final 2 rows that we've just sewn. Going to press those seams open and then this will be nice and finished. To make sure that I like the way that it looks. So we have these 4, then we have the ones with the pink that are going to be the corners. And you will see that we have one fabric that kind of runs down diagonally in both directions, which is the purple and the yellow in this case. So here we have the other 2 corners. And then this is going to be our finished block. Then I like to sew them together by rows. So first, the next quilt motif that we're going to make is Love in the Mist. So here we have fabric A, B and C. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to combine some of these half triangles and we're going to make 8 pieces. So I'm just going to move those other pieces to the side real quick. So we're going to put these on top of each other with the right sides together until we have done that basically 8 times. So now we have those 8 pieces and we're going to sew along this edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then once you've done that and we fold it open and press the seam allowance, we will have little squares like that. So I will meet you back here once we've sewn everything. So here we have a chain and we're going to break all of these threads. And then I'm just going to press all of these seams open. And here those look after ironing, and I am going to trim all of these little corners. And after we've done that, we're going to sew them together with these squares. And we're going to have our white fabric, which is our background, basically like this. Then a yellow one here, which is our star. And then one in the corner, just like this. We're going to sew these 2 together and these 2 together. And then they will be joined together to create one bigger square. So we're going to sew these together. And we're going to take that right side piece and put it on this one with right sides touching. And we're going to sew along this edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And you need to repeat that 4 times because we need 4 of these pieces. Now we're going to repeat that for the piece that is going to sit on the bottom, which is this. But here we have that half triangle square piece that is on the right side. We're just putting that on top of this one. Then here we will have our chain piece, which consists of those 4 bottom pieces and those 4 top pieces. I'm going to just clip those threads so they're all separate. And now we're going to be sewing them together. So you can either take this to the ironing board and just press those seams, and you want to press them in the opposite direction of how we're going to be sewing them. But I like to just stay here and then press them with my fingers. I like to press it towards the side that doesn't have a seam, just to remove some of that bulk. So this will sit on top of it like this. And here again, the seam is pressed towards the side that doesn't have any other seams. So we'll put this on top of each other so the right sides are together. Make sure that these seams are basically nice and on top of each other like this, but they're in a different direction. Then we will sew this side with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then when you flip those open, we will have 4 of these pieces. And I'm going to take them to the ironing board and press open this seam. So here are those finished pieces. As you can see, they're the same size as the square that we're using for the center. So if that's the case, then you know you're right on track. So we are going to just keep these pieces separate and start assembling the final piece. So this is our bigger square of the fabric, I think it is fabric B. And we're going to use the background fabric A in 2 top corners and then the other fabric C in the bottom corners. So we're going to sew those basically like this. So we're going to take one of these squares. We're going to take the background fabric triangle and put that on top. And then you want this to be nice and centered so that these corners of the triangle will actually overlap over the square. And we're going to sew this edge with a 1/4 inch of seam allowance. Then we will fold that open just like this, and then we will attach the next one. And we're going to work our final triangles. And you want these seams to be open. Now you can take this to the iron, or you can just use a roller. Then on one side you're going to use fabric C, and then on the other side fabric A, just like before. Then after you've sewn the triangles of fabric C, you just have those final 4 triangles of fabric A left to do, which we're sewing in the exact same manner, just placing that on top, making sure that those little corners of the triangle overlap, and starting to sew right at that join. And now we're going to assemble our entire block together. So here we have the piece for the center. Then these are going to be the outside. Then these are going to be the corners. So those are placed just like this. So they're kind of creating a little star in that golden fabric. Then these pink ones should also form a star with that center motif. So they are placed like this. And then this is how we're going to assemble everything together. I like to sew by column. So we have column 1, 2, and then 3. So this one I keep separate for now. And then here I'm just going to place these on top of each other. So right sides are together. And then I'm going to take this to the sewing machine. So here we have row 1. Since this is a more complicated quilt block, I am using a few pins here and there, but also if you're a beginner, I do really recommend pins. But I tend to not really use those anymore. But I like to pin right in the center. So you want basically that seam of those triangles where they meet to be right at that seam here. And then I'm going to sew this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then after sewing, I always like to just open it up so I can see what I've sewn and if I'm happy with those seams, which I think those look pretty good. And then I'm going to grab column number 3, which is here. And then we're going to attach it row by row. So here we have row number 1, This should be right on top of this one in the center. Again, making sure that this is nicely touching and placing a pin right in that center and then sewing. And then you can kind of see how the quilt block is supposed to look. I'm going to take this to the ironing board and I'm going to clip all of those threads and press all of those seams. So I'm going to press open all of the seams that we've just sewn. So here we have row number 1 and 1 from the center, and I'm just putting the center one on top. And then I will start by aligning those seams that we've just pressed open, and then I pin there. And then I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and sew this entire edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then I like to fold it open, make sure that everything is nice and even, or if anything needs to be adjusted. And then we're going to add that final row. So I'm going to pin that final row in place, sew that with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then we're going to press those 2 rows that we've just done open by the ironing board. Now I'm going to be sewing the checkerboard star. So here we have fabric A, B, C and D. First of all, we have 8 of these and we're going to pair those with this fabric. So we have all of these little squares and they're each going to have a matching pair of fabric C, and I'm just going to put those on top of each other, and then we will sew one of these seams with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So we can just chain stitch all of these together. And then we will have 2 of these left over, which we are going to pair with that fabric D, which we also cut 2 squares from. So I'm also going to put those on top of each other. And these are our remaining pieces. So we have those triangles and then our big rectangles. The rectangles we're not going to use right now, but we are going to also sew the big triangles onto the smaller triangles. So you're going to take that smaller triangle, you're going to put that on top of that bigger triangle and line up that bottom edge, and then that smaller triangle should overlap here at the top, but that is our seam allowance. So we're going to basically sew a straight edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I will just show you how that's going to look. You could also mark it beforehand, but I don't spend that kind of time on it. And then this will be the seam that we're going to sew, and you're going to repeat that for all of the bigger triangles, and we're just starting with one side. So I'm going to take all of these pieces to the sewing machine and then I will meet you back here. So here we have all of these finished squares, and I'm just going to rip the seams of the chain, and I'm going to keep those 2 with the contrasting fabric for the center. I'm just going to keep those separate, and we're going to start with those. So here you want basically to open this up. You always have to have these seams pressed in the opposite direction. You can either take this to the ironing board, you can finger press it, or you can use a little roller like this, which is what I like to do, just by the sewing machine, because that makes it quite a bit easier. So I'm pressing those seams in the same direction, which in this case is towards the pink fabric. Then I put those on top of each other, really making sure that those seams are touching each other. Then I'm going to sew this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then that is our finished piece. And this is actually what we are going to repeat for all of these other squares. Now we're at the ironing board, and I'm going to press open all of those seams from those checkerboard squares that we've just made. So we have 1 in a contrasting fabric and then 4 of these. Squares are now finished, and then we're also going to iron the beginning of those flying geese pieces. Just need to separate that chain, and I don't have my nice clippers here. So we're going to take this and then press this upwards. So here we have that iron piece, and we have those leftover triangles. And we're just repeating that process that we just did. So I'm going to put those on top of each other and then sew right along this seam or edge with 1/4 inch of seam allowance. And you're going to repeat that for all of the pieces and then iron those upwards just like before. Next we will be joining our flying geese together with our rectangles. And we want those 2 triangles to be at the top and then that rectangle at the bottom. And we're going to sew this in this direction on top of each other. And we're going to sew right along this edge with 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then I'm going to press all of these seam allowances open. Here we have our current layout. We have that centerpiece, and then you want all of these seams that we ironed open to basically be laying like this. So we have that main fabric that is going in a diagonal line like this. And here we have our flying geese with the rectangles attached. That is going to create our stars. So those are going to be exactly like this. And now we're going to sew this together. I like to take the 3rd column and just leave it there and just focus on this. So we're going to sew these on top of each other. This is going to be like this. So always, of course, with the right sides together. And I like to chain stitch this. So I'm going to sew this, then this one, and then this one, whilst the thread is still attached. And then you really want these seams to be nicely on top of each other. So you can either pin this in place or you can just use your hands. Since this is a little bit more of a complicated quilt motif, I do like to pin. Usually I like to just go and try, but this time I am pinning it in place. And you can always open it up just to see how that looks. And then we're gonna sew this. And we are backstitching, of course. So here we have those 3 pieces attached together, and we can take our next column. So we can just open this up. This is going to be in the center, and then this one is going to be right beside it. So I put that on top. Again, going to pin those seams in place. And now we just need to finish these rows. So we are going to cut all of these threads. So since this is one of the more difficult motifs, I am just going to take this to the ironing board and then make sure that these seams are ironed in a different direction, or you can open them. It depends on what you find easier. I think for this I am going to press all of these seams open, and then we are also pinning everything in place. So I have ironed all of these seams open, as you can see, and now we're going to pin this together. And I like to start with that center row and a top piece and just put that on top of each other, right sides touching. And then I'm going to start by pinning these 2 seams that I've just ironed and pressed open. And then when I'm pinning it, I'm actually pinning it to sit right in that seam. And then you can see that we actually have multiple seams that we really need to match up. So we also have one here. And you can always just flip it around to see if you're pinning it correctly. Then I'm going to sew this entire edge with 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then I will press that open, and then I will repeat this for that final bottom row. So if you're making closure option 2, then it will look like this. So I'm going to be continuing cutting out all of the pieces. Of course, you just follow basically the directions. So view B only, cut 1 lining fabric, cut 1 padding, cut 1 main fabric on the fold. You want to make sure that you pay attention to that. And this basically means that there's no specific grain because it's a circle. So it doesn't really matter how you put it on the fabric, as long as you put it on the fold. Then here for closure 2 in the front and back, it is quite important to not have the batting basically on that top piece. So we have some notches here. So I'm going to snip into that notch. So here we can see our pattern piece. Now I'm going to be showing you how to make view A, which is the rectangle view. I'm also going to be showing you how I'm making it without the closure 2. So I'm using closure 1, which I have already cut here. So you can see how that looks. It's just a little bit more narrow and then more like a rectangle. So I cut that in some contrasting fabric. So that is going to be our closure option. And because I just used this pattern piece for a closure option 2, you can see that I stuck that on the top notch. So for this I'm just going to basically fold it towards the inside, so I can keep that piece attached in case I want to use it in the future, but now it's not in my way. And now because we are making view A, we will also be needing this piece, which is the base piece for view A. So it says view A only, attached to front and back, which is this piece, at the bottom notch. So here we have that center bottom notch and then those two that we use as a guide. Here I am making the largest version, so you can see that this base piece falls exactly nicely at those notches. Then I just take some tape, we stuck that in place. So this is how our finished piece looks for view A. You really need this base piece or else you're making view B. Now I am moving on to the lining fabric. So it says cut 2 lining fabric, cut 2 batting and then cut 1 of the main fabric. Because for the main fabric we have that other piece that's going to have the quilted piece in the front. So I will show you how to do that later, but we're taking it one step at a time. So I'm going to start with the lining. And then for this bag I'm also going to do the pocket one, which is the long inside pocket. And it just says to use one in a contrasting fabric. Although for this sample I'm just using the same lining fabric. So I'm going for a little bit more of a neutral looking bag. So here we have that pocket piece just cut out. First I'm just going to iron it to remove any creases. Then I'm going to fold and iron the top edge by 3/4 of an inch, which is 2 centimeters. So I'm just going to fold that to the inside. So of course, if you have a wrong or right side of a fabric, this would be your wrong side that you're facing. And then I'm going to fold that again by 2 centimeters. Then I like to just turn this around to make it a little bit easier for myself. But now I'm going to finish this bottom edge. First going to fold it towards the inside by 5 millimeters. And we're going to do that twice. Just like in the other fold. And then folding and ironing that again. Then the smaller fold we're just going to leave like this for now. But this bigger one we're actually going to sew down. So we're going to edge stitch as close to this folded edge as possible. And then I will meet you back here once I've done that. So here we have the pocket piece where we just edge stitched. So now we're going to attach this on one of our linings. Place that down. Now you could place this basically anywhere that you would like, but I would avoid basically putting it too close towards the edge because you want to leave some space between our seam and then that bottom edge, but you also don't want to go too close to the top like this because there are also going to be seams here. So I like to put it right in the center of this square, which is the center also for the view B, because this measurement is the same. For view A we just have this little rectangle attached to it. So if you want to be really precise, then you could just measure this. Then I'm just going to use some little sewing clips. You can also use pins to just keep this in place. Then this is a long and divided pocket, so you could just leave it like this and just sew up this bottom edge, which is what we're going to do first. But I like to first just mark out where I want to exactly divide these pockets. So this is the size large. For the large and medium sized bags, I do recommend dividing it into at least 3 compartments. And then for the extra small and the small bag, I would just divide it in half. So basically find the center, which you can do by also using your notch, and then just marking a line straight down. There are 2 tools that you can use, either a Hera marker, which is just going to crease the fabric, or you can actually use like a fabric chalk, but of course this is going to leave a visual change, so you do have to remove that later, or use one of those air erasable markers. So again, you could just measure this width, which is for me around 14 inches. So I know that the halfway mark is about here at 7 inches. And of course I have my notch there as well. So I'm going to take my ruler, put it down right next to my notch, Then I think I am going to use my hair marker, just because my chalk needs to be removed in the washing machine. And I don't want to put this back in the washing machine. So I'm just marking out that center. And then here you can kind of see the crease that it made. I think it's a little bit difficult to tell, but there you can see. So now we have about 7 inches on this side and 7 inches on that side as well. So you could just mark out the center, which then divided by half, of course, is 3.5. But we do have 1 centimeter of seam allowance here as well. So if you really want it to be perfect, then you would have to measure this and then subtract that 1 centimeter of seam allowance, which is 3/8 of an inch. So it's basically more like 6.5 that I have here without that 1 centimeter seam allowance. So I would measure here 3.25 from that first line that I just marked with my hair marker. And then I'm just repeating that for the other side. So I'm actually dividing this pocket into 4 compartments. So now I'm going to take this to the sewing machine. First we're just going to edge stitch right alongside this bottom edge, just so the pocket is secure and we have the placement correct. And then I will sew these 3 lines, which will divide the pocket into 4 compartments. Then whilst I'm here at the sewing machine, I'm also going to attach our little notions clip. So here I've cut a piece of like embroidery ribbon, decorative ribbon I guess, that is 5 centimeters long, which is around 2 inches. And then I have one of these little swivel clasps. So of course I thread this little ribbon through that circle of my clasp and fold that in half so that it's going to look like this. And then I like to put it right on top of where that pocket ends and then just sew along this top edge. And it kind of depends where I put it. You can basically, again, put it anywhere. Near the top is more preferred than near the bottom, of course, because you want to access it quite easily. And I like to put it near the pocket just because I think that looks cute. And then I backstitch a couple of times and that will look like this. Next up, I'm going to show you how to sew the zipper pocket, which is pocket number 2. So here we have the back, then we have 2 of the bottom pieces and then 2 of the top pieces. Now I am just going to start with the top pieces. So here I have them in my lining fabric. You cannot really see a right or wrong side for my personal fabric, but you want to have your zipper basically folded with the right side of the zipper on the right side of the fabric, and we're going to pin that in place. As you can see, my zipper is a little bit long and you want to leave a little bit of a spacing, as you can see here, at the top piece, so where the zipper pull is gonna be. And then for the bottom piece, we're actually always going to sew over that. So that doesn't really matter too much because we're working with a plastic zipper. So I'm gonna pin this in place so I know where I need to stop. And then I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine as well as the other pieces. So now we're at the sewing machine. You can switch to a zipper foot, but honestly for these kind of zippers I usually just use my regular sewing foot. And I'm just gonna sew right alongside my zipper. That seam allowance is smaller than a centimeter. I believe usually it's more like 6 millimeters or 1/4 of an inch. Then I like to have my needle down and lift my presser foot up. Then I can pull that zipper pull out of the way and sew until the end. So here we have our first seam finished. So now we're going to finish the opposite side with another piece. So again, we're taking that top piece. I am just placing that on top, and then I like to flip this over so I can actually see my previous stitching, and then I'm going to sew exactly on top of that. Now you can pin this in place or you can just sew. Now we are starting at the zipper pull, so I am pulling that down just a little bit so it's not in my way. And you do want to make sure that those top pieces are nicely aligned. And then I'm going to just follow my stitching. And then when you've pulled these pieces open and on top of each other, so the wrong sides are touching from the lining pieces, you can see that that zipper is now nicely encased into that lining fabric. So it looks the same on both sides. And we're going to do the exact same with the other pieces, so with the 2 bottom pieces of the pocket. Then I will take one of these bottom pieces, I will take the zipper piece and again place that on top of each other with the right sides on top of each other. And then I'm gonna sew along the sides. Then taking that other bottom piece, just placing that on top, then flipping this over and then sewing my previous stitching again. So here's how that pocket piece looks now. You can see that both sides are nicely encased into that lining fabric. And now we are going to give this a quick press at the ironing board. Now I like to take this pocket piece and then just fold it in half. And then I'm just going to round those corners a little bit. So that's going to look like this. And then I will repeat that for the back piece. So I will just put this on top and then cut around those corners. Then I move my zipper pull down a little bit and I'm going to trim away this excess of my zipper. And I'm also going to do that on the other side. Then I'm placing this piece with the zipper right on top of that back piece and then I'm going to pin that in place. Then I flip it over towards the wrong side and this is where we will start sewing around the entire circumference of that pocket piece. And here in this tutorial I'm actually going to use my self-made piece of bias strip. So this is just, I think, 50 centimeters long and then an inch wide, or aka 2.5 centimeters wide. And then I will just trim this edge to be straight because I got that on the bias. Then I'm gonna sew around this with 6 millimeters or 1/4 of an inch of seam allowance. And then we're going to finish this bias tape. So you can take this to the ironing board now and just press this towards this seam allowance. Or you can just continue sewing, which is what I'm doing. So I'm going to fold this in first by 6 millimeters and then just folding that again. So basically this should cover your previous stitching. And then we're going to sew on top of that with an edge stitch. And that is how it looks after sewing, and you can see that now the pocket piece is actually completely encased, so all of the raw edges are finished, except of course for this top edge. Now I'm going to sew that pocket to the inside of our lining. So first of all, you do just want to place that down on your back piece or your lining piece. I like to just place it in the center, but you could go more like upwards or more downwards. That is kind of personal preference. So mine is a little bit more centered, maybe just a little bit more to the top for easy access, but you don't want it too close to the top because we do have seam allowances here. So there are measurements in the pattern of where not to place it, basically. And then I'm going to use this trim because this is what I have on hand that I think will look really cute. It is a tiny bit wider than what is listed in the pattern. In the pattern I talk about a 1 centimeter wide ribbon. Mine is actually 1.5, so you know, it's a tiny difference. But you could do any kind of ribbon basically that you like. And I'm also going to attach my notions clip to this as well. So we're going to cut a piece that's going to be long enough for both our notions piece with some seam allowance folded. There are measurements in the pattern once again for this, but as you can see, this is super easy to just measure out yourself. And then I want a little bit of seam allowance on this side as well. Then I'm going to cut that. So first I am folding this edge in twice. And I'm going to pin that in place. And I like to pin it in place where basically this pocket edge falls right in that center of my decorative ribbon. Because if you do it anywhere near the edges, it is a little bit more difficult to sew over it. So it's going to make it less secure. And then I'm going to repeat that for the other side with my notions clip attached. Just making sure that this is all nice and even and pinning that in place. Then I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and I'm just going to sew a box all around this decorative ribbon to secure this pocket in place. And this is our completed zipper pocket. So as you can see, you could just open this and then put any kinds of notions inside, like a pen will fit inside, but also a measuring tape, and that is just really nice and it just keeps everything nice and secure. So this is actually one of my favorite pockets for this pattern, just because, yeah, nothing is ever gonna fall out. And you also have your little notions clip and some decorative ribbon where you can really play around with any kind of fabric combinations, you know, play around with the bias tape that you're using. So it's just a lot of fun. Next up, I'm going to finish the entire lining piece. So here I have the lining piece with the pocket, and then we have that other lining piece. So I put them right sides together on top of each other and just match up all of those seams. You can pin this in place, but as you can maybe tell from this tutorial so far that I don't use a lot of pins and I usually just go for it. And it's also because I just have a lot of experience already making these bags. And then I'm going to sew this with a 1 centimeter seam allowance which is 3/8 of an inch. Then I'm going to sew the side edge, this bottom edge of our rectangle, and then this side edge as well. And then our lining piece will look like this. And now we're going to finish these corners. So we're actually going to have these seams meet each other. You could press these seams open, but personally I never really do, and I just finger press them open and put them on top of each other, which I probably recommend you to do the same, because this is a little bit of a tricky seam to iron, because basically once you start ironing this, you're just making creases in other places because it's three-dimensional. So I just put them on top of each other and put a clip on there so I know that they're right on top of each other. And then I'm going to sew this seam with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. And you can see that this seam kind of creates that three-dimensional shape of making it a rectangular bag. And here you can see the seam that we haven't done yet. So I'm just repeating that process, putting this on top of each other, finger pressing these seam allowances open and putting a sewing clip right on top of there, and then sewing again with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And this is now our lining. You can see it is quite three-dimensional, and I am actually going to leave it like this, so the inside is now facing the outside, and then I'm going to now work on the main of the bag. Here I'm going to sew the lining for a few bees. So here I have one of my lining pieces, and I'm going to place my other lining piece on top with right sides touching. And I'm going to sew both of these side seams with 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch of seam allowance. Then here I also have my circle base that I'm now going to attach to this lining with the side seams. So I'm going to finger press this side seam open, and then I'm going to line that up with one of these notches, and I'm going to pin that in place. Then I'm going to find that notch on the opposite side, and I'm going to place my other side seam there, once again with those seam allowances open, and then pin this in place. And then we just have these last two notches. So we have here the notch on the front and back piece that marks the halfway point or the center. And I'm going to line this up with this notch. And then repeat that for this final notch. And then with the remaining space, I try to just evenly divide that and just place a pin in between. And then I'm going to sew around this entire base with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch of seam allowance. Next up, I'm going to be showing you how I'm adding the back pocket to my view A, which is pocket number 3. So here we have the back piece. As you can see, I'm doing the scrunch closure, which I believe is closure number 2. So my batting stops a bit earlier before my fabric does. So every time we're measuring something, we are measuring from the batting. So this is actually notch 1. So that's where we'll be measuring from. And I'm going to iron first the pockets, and then I'm going to place that on our back piece. So I'm placing the pocket down with the wrong sides facing up. Then I'm going to iron this first top edge by 2 centimeters towards the inside. And then I'm going to fold that again by 2 centimeters and press. Then the next step for this pocket is I kind of like to just fold it in half so that I can make sure that everything is nice and even. And then I'm just going to round these corners. You can do this how much or how less you like it, of course. And next I'm going to iron also these edges. And I'm going to fold those twice by around 6 millimeters, which is 1/4 of an inch. And I'm going to iron those as well. Then for now I'm just putting those seams open again. And then I'm going to finish that first top edge with a top stitch or an edge stitch as close to this edge as possible. And then we can sew our pocket to our back piece. So here we have my back piece and then the finished pocket where I just sewed that edge. As you can see now, this edge is kind of become unfolded. So you could just take this again and then just press it with the iron again. And we are doing a rounded curve, so all of these kind of rounded seams will be a little bit scrunched up, but that is completely normal and something that is not going to be visible anymore once we've sewn it. Then I'm flipping the pocket over so that it is right sides facing. Now I'm going to take my measuring tape and I'm going to measure from the top edge towards my pocket and then also from my pocket towards this straight bottom edge, so not the full rectangle, which is view A, but also for view B, of course, that's gonna end right there. And then I'm actually going to take a fabric chalk and I'm just going to mark a line here where that pocket is ending. And then I'm also going to mark the halfway point. So for this right now, for me that is about 3 inches. And I'm just gonna mark a straight line that is going up. So you can see here, it's a little bit difficult to tell because it's pink, but we can see here that that is where the pocket is ending, but then also a straight line up. And now we're going to sew our Velcro. So here I have a tiny square of Velcro. You can also make this as big or as small as you'd like. I believe in the pattern the measurement is 3 centimeters, but mine is a bit smaller. Then you can do the soft side on the pocket or the back piece. It doesn't really matter like where you put one of these, but I am going to kind of find the center of my pocket just by folding it so I know where the center is, which is right there. And then I'm going to place that on top, just like this, taking some pins. Then I'm going to pin that in place. So we will take that to the sewing machine. And then I'm also going to sew the opposite side of my Velcro to the back piece, which as you can see here for the pocket piece, we marked where that pocket ended, but then I placed my Velcro just slightly lower. So I will repeat that for the back piece here. So this is where I will be sewing my Velcro. And I'm also going to pin that in place. Then I'm going to take both of these pieces to the sewing machine and just sew a little box around the Velcro on both of them. So here we have our back piece with our Velcro now attached and also that pocket piece. I'm actually just going to place those Velcro pieces on top of each other because that is basically acting as a pin. Like now that pocket is not really moving as much. And then I'm just going to refold those edges that we pressed earlier and I'm going to pin those in place. And then once I'm happy with my placement and everything is looking somewhat symmetrical, I'm actually just going to top stitch all around this pocket, except of course for that top edge where we placed the Velcro, because that is going to be the opening of our pocket. So right here at the end, I'm going to put my needle down, lift my presser foot up and pivot and turn. Then after sewing just a little bit straight across, I am doing that again. So we're sewing down again. And then here is how that pocket will look. It's not the neatest stitching that I've ever done, but it's also my fabric that is a little bit tricky to work with. So I think that is quite alright. Next up, I'm going to be showing you how to make pocket 4, which is the back pocket for view B. So here I have already folded this top edge twice by 2 centimeters and ironed that in place. So that looks nice and neat right now. Then I also have here my back piece with the batting already ironed. And I'm actually going to take that pocket piece and I'm just going to place that right on top. And this should be the same width. Then I just like to take a pin and then pin that in place on both sides, just so that it doesn't move. And now we can start dividing this pocket into different compartments. And the sizes, there are no sizes basically in the pattern, because this is something that you can really customize. So I kind of like not having to offer a size to you, just based on your preferences. So I recommend maybe getting some tools or needles or basically whatever you like to put into these pockets and then marking as desired. And you do just want to make sure that this first seam, of course, is going to be our seam allowance, so you don't want to take that into account for your pockets. You could just mark out that first centimeter or 3/8 of an inch, which I think is what I am going to do here, just so that I don't forget that, yeah, for my pocket measurements. And you don't see this later anyways. So now you can measure the space between, which for me is about 17 centimeters or almost 10.5 inches. And then you could divide that into, well, all kinds of different compartments. I think I really want one bigger compartment right here. So I am already going to mark that. You can use either your fabric marker again, but mine needs water to wash out. So I'm actually going to use my Hera marker, which kind of forms a crease, which I also quite like to use for, well, in this case, like the quilting kind of things. So I will show how that looks. I just press down quite firmly across where I want it. Of course, I use a ruler so it's nice and straight. And you can kind of see that it forms a crease just like that. So that is going to be my big pocket. Then I think it would be nice to maybe have one that is an inch next to it, so it's a little bit bigger. Then maybe another one that is an inch. So you can see here 1, 2, 3 creases that I've just made. And I'm going to make my pockets just a little bit smaller. So I think I'm gonna do, let's see, like 3/4 of an inch. I think for my back I am going to shorten this pocket just a little bit because I would like to put my interchangeable needles maybe in there sometimes. And those are actually quite a bit shorter than my pocket. So I think for my pocket I am just going to trim right until there. But that is the fun thing about sewing, is that it's so easily customizable and you can just make things the measurements that you would like. Then I'm removing my pins. And of course I have still all of those markings. Now the first thing that I'm going to do is actually edge stitch across this entire folded edge so that is securely in place. And then we're going to sew down all of those marked lines on our back piece, of course. So we're gonna go to the sewing machine. Then here we have our back piece. Then I'm placing the pocket on top. And I'm going to start by sewing my first line. So this was my first marking. And I'm going to, of course, make sure the back stitch well at the beginning and at the end, so it's nice and secure. So here is that finished pocket with all of the lines sewn down, and I'm just going to give this a quick press. And that is our pocket for finished. And now we can continue sewing as usual. And you can also just check if your tools fit. So for example, my Hera marker fits in there perfectly, of course, if this was closed up. And of course, I don't know, I have a pen here. You can see kind of the vision of the little tools in the back pocket. It's very nice in my opinion. So I will be finishing the front and then you can continue sewing the back as usual. So here we have our batting piece with the glue side facing up, which you can actually feel the difference because it's textured. Then I'm going to place the main fabric right on top so that the wrong side of the fabric is touching that glue side of the batting. And then I'm going to just iron that in place. So this is going to be the back of the bag, so I'm just going to keep that aside. Then we can take our front batting piece. And this is going to be a little bit different because this is where we're going to have our quilt motif. So here we have the quilt motif that is called Love in the Mist. This one is quite large because this one is actually 12 inches large. So as you can see, it covers almost the entire piece of the bag, which is going to be different depending on which quilt block you picked and of course which size of bag you're making. So I'm actually going to put my quilt block right in the center, so I have a tiny bit of space left on the front and on the bottom and also on the sides. And then I'm just going to iron this in place. For this size I'm actually not adding any fabric to the top and the bottom just because this little piece of batting that we have here is still within the seam allowance, so it's not really necessary. But I am going to be putting it on the sides of this. And I'm going to show you quickly an example of if you were to use a smaller block, like this one for example is quite drastically smaller. But if you were to iron this in the center, of course you have a bigger space here and on the bottom, which we will then leave or like sew a piece of fabric attached to, which is explained in the pattern. But like I mentioned, that is going to be changed depending on which block you picked and which size of bag you're making. And since this is the largest bag, you could put technically any kind of block there. So then I'm going to take my main fabric, so I have that here with me. Then I'm also going to take my measuring tape. So I'm going to measure the difference between the batting and the block. which is here in this case about 1.5 centimeters for me. And then I'm going to always add 1/2 inch for seam allowance, which is also around 1.5 centimeters actually. So I need a very narrow piece of just 3 centimeters wide, and then the length of this 13.5 inches. So I'm going to take my main fabric and I'm going to just cut 2 strips that are 3 centimeters wide and then 13.5 centimeters or 13.5 inches tall. So here we have those 2 finished strips and of course my main front piece. Now I'm going to place this down like so, right on top. As you can see, I made it a bit too long, but that's no issue because it's better to have it too long rather than too short. And then I'm actually going to sew right alongside this edge with 1/4 inch of seam allowance, because that is what we did in the block. And then once we fold that over, as you can see, that's just going to fit right alongside that edge just to finish it off. So I've just finished sewing those seams and now I'm going to take the iron and I'm just going to press this towards the padding. And then I'm just going to snip this off. So here's how the front looks currently, and now we just have to finish this bottom part of the fusible padding. So I'm again going to measure this. So I like to just measure again the length. So right now for me that's 8 centimeters. And then of course we also need that entire width of the bag, which is 35. And then I'm going to repeat that process that I just did. So I'm going to put this on top with the wrong sides facing the right side of our front piece. I'm going to sew along this entire bottom edge with 1/4 inch seam allowance. Of course, I want to really try and match this up with the quilt block. And then I'm going to flip it over and iron it down. So that bottom piece is now nicely and secure. So I'm just going to flip this over so that I can see the wrong side. And then I'm going to trim away all of this fabric. And then our front piece is finished. So now we can get started on sewing this piece, so we can then afterwards attach the lining. So here we have the front piece, then I have the back piece. Just putting them on top of each other, right sides together. Then again I'm going to sew this long edge with 1 centimeter seam allowance, as well as the bottom edge and that other side seam. So 1 centimeter is 3/8 inch. So we're going to do that. Then just like we did for the lining, I'm going to finish the corners just by flipping this or pulling this, then putting the seam allowances on top of each other and finger pressing the seam allowance open. And then for the main fabric, I do really like to use a pin, and then actually I like to pin right between both seams so that I can actually see it pop up on the wrong side. So then I know that they're securely on top of each other. And then I'm going to sew this with 1 centimeter seam again. And after sewing the side seams of view B, I'm just going to find that side seam and I'm going to finger press that open. And then I'm going to place that on top one of the notches of our base and then pin that in place. And I'm gonna do the exact same thing for the notch on the opposite side. And then also the notch that we have for each center point. And then I'm going to pin the rest of the bag in place. And then I'm gonna sew around the entire base of the bag with 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch of seam allowance. Then I'm going to take one of those pieces. Of course, remember that they need to be folded twice. I'm going to put that under the sewing machine and then edge stitch that in place. And so you can of course still see that seam that we did the first time. I'm just going to fold it back on that seam and iron that again. And this is what we're going to be attaching to the bag. So here we have the main bag. Here is the front. Now you can also just fold these pieces in half and just find that center and then marking it by just cutting a tiny little notch. And then I like to find the center of my quilt piece or my bag, which does also have a notch. Then I put it on top of there. And then you can either pin this in place or use some sewing clips, which is what I'm doing here. And now we have it pinned on the front piece, and then I'm going to repeat that for the back piece as well. And you do want to be careful that that open side of the piece is actually on this side of the bag, so you don't actually have it twisted the wrong way, because then you're going to have this weird open seam. Then we are back at the sewing machine. I'm going to remove this part of my sewing machine so that I have a smaller circumference, which is just going to make it a little bit easier to actually sew the bag, especially the smaller sizes. Then you can basically start anywhere on the bag, but I like to start at the side seam. Make sure that that is still open. I'm gonna put that underneath my sewing machine. And then I'm going to sew around this circumference with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. For all of the sizes, you're not really going to sew over the actual patchwork, but here I did. So I'm just going to check my points and see if everything looks nice. Now you can just keep this folded down, and we're going to get the lining piece. So here we have the main bag, and then here we have the lining piece that is still inside out. I like to always put the pocket on the side where we have the back of the bag, but it doesn't really matter all too much, but that's just something that I like to do. So here I just put my main bag with the right sides facing out inside of my lining piece. And then I'm going to finger press that seam allowance of my lining open. And I'm going to match that up with my seam allowance of my bag. And then I'm going to pin that in place or use sewing clips. Then I'm going to do the same for the opposite side. And since we of course have those notches in the bag, it's nice to just match those up so you know that everything is evenly divided around the bag. And then I like to sew this with the main bag facing, because here we have that stitching that we've previously done for the closure pieces. And I'm going to sew over that stitching so I know that it's exactly 1 centimeter. So we're going to sew around the circumference of the entire bag, but we're going to leave an opening, which is very important. If you don't leave an opening, you're not going to be able to turn your bag to the right side. I like to leave an opening of about 10 centimeters, which is around 4 inches. But the bigger you leave the opening, the more of a hole you're going to have to hide, but also the easier it will be to get the bag to the right side. Especially for the thicker fabrics and the smaller sizes, it can be a little bit tricky, but also for the larger size actually. And you can always take your seam ripper and just pull back some stitches, but it's nice if you back stitch a lot so that it's really nice and secure. Then I'm of course going to use that opening, and I'm going to start pulling my bag to the right side through that opening. And I like to start by just grabbing one of the pieces, so I'm not going to grab the lining and the main piece at the same time. I'm just grabbing that main piece and making sure that is completely pulled out, and then the lining will kind of just follow on its own. Now here is how that top part looks. As you can see, it looks a little bit weird and wrinkled right now. So I do like to just give this a quick press with the iron before I'm actually going to sew up this hole, because that just makes it a lot more neat, and you know for sure that everything is nicely spread out and you don't get any weird puckers or creases, etc. And then here we have that hole, and I always make sure that the seam allowance is correct, so I try my best to get that seam allowance correct and then just put that on top. And then I like to pin this in place, but my pins are at my sewing machine. Oh, there's one here. So I will just pin that in place. And I will pin it in place right along that edge, because that's where we're going to be stitching. And then I just like to turn it towards the right side so that I know that it's actually in the correct spot. Because sometimes if you didn't iron this properly, you can see that that is not like nicely on top of each other, because this is the part that's going to be visible. So you really want to nicely edge stitch along that top closure edge. So I'm going to take this to the sewing machine, and then this bag is actually going to be finished. And we just have the drawstring left to do. So we are at the sewing machine. I like to start on the opposite side where I don't have my hole, just because I find that a little bit easier to not immediately start with that. And I still have the option of putting this around my machine, which is nice and easy. And I'm going to just edge stitch right along this top edge. I am going to choose a little bit of a longer stitch length. And then here I can see that this is where I have my hole, because I see the pin. So I'm going to remove my pin, and then I'm going to sew on top. And then here you can see the hole is now closed and everything else is looking really nice and neat. So this is it from the right side of the bag, and then you can see from the inside that everything is really nice and smooth and you don't have any creases. I'm going to give this one more press and then we can just insert the drawstring and then the bag is done. Next I'm going to insert this drawstring of the bag. So here I just like to take my drawstring that I have and then I'm just going to measure it. You can also use the given lengths that are in the pattern, but sometimes, well usually, I just like to kind of eyeball it, and then I will cut a piece and then I'm going to cut another piece that is the same length. For closure option 2, this opening or the drawstring tunnel is a lot smaller than it is for closure option 1. So here I like to use this little tool that is by Clover, which is really nice. I also use this for elastic, etc. And then I can just push this through and it just makes for a really easy drawstring. Then we knot these together. And then I'm going to start on the opposite side for this one. And then tie those two together. And then the drawstring is finished and you can just close up the bag like this, which looks really cute, or you can just leave it open and you still have some room there. And that is our rectangle view A bag finished in the size large, which does take up almost the entire bag because we have a 12-inch quilt block on the front. Then we don't have any pockets on the back, but we do have a long and divided pocket, which is pocket 1, I think. Yeah, pocket 1 on the inside, which I divided in 4 compartments. And then we have our little notions hanger, which really matches very nicely with the bag. So I'm super happy with how this one turned out. Now I'm going to show you how to make closure option 2. And as you can see here, I am working view A, but this is basically the same for view A as well as view B. So first I am going to finish the side seams just as before. So I am going to measure the width between the edge of my batting and the edge of my quilt motif, which for me is about 1.5 inch. Then I'm gonna add 1/2 inch to that measurement for seam allowance. Then I'm also going to measure the length of my quilt block, which for me is 6.5 inch because I'm working the 6-inch quilt block. This is the checkerboard. So I will take my main fabric and cut 2 rectangles in those measurements. Then I will take my front piece, I will place this on top. So right sides are together on both sides. As you can see, I made my rectangles just a little bit too short, so that is my bad, but this will still fall within my seam allowance, so it's fine. And now I'm going to sew this edge with 1/4 inch of seam allowance, as well as this edge, and then I will meet you back here. Now we're going to press and iron these pieces in the opposite direction. And since we're using fusible batting, this is then going to secure. Now we're going to finish that bottom piece. So if you're working view B, you would just measure this length because we don't have this rectangle here. But I'm working view A, so I'm measuring from that rectangle to the bottom of my quilt piece, which for me is 3.25. So I need to have a length that is 3 3/4 because we're adding 1/2 inch once again. And then also the entire width of my front piece, which for me is 9 3/4. Then I'm going to repeat that previous process. So I'm going to place this on top and then sew this edge with 1/4 inch of seam allowance. And then we will iron that towards the opposite side. And next up we are going to finish that top edge, which this is the step that is different from basically closure 1, because here we have the batting that stops until notch 1. So we have a much longer piece to measure in reality than we do when we have closure 1, which we will just measure to the edge of the batting. So here I'm actually going to measure this. I'm putting my pieces next to each other, and then I'm going to measure the difference between the edge of this piece, so my quilt motif, and the top edge of my back piece, which for me is 2 3/4, so I need a piece that is 3 1/4. And then we are using the same width, this, as before. So I have my rectangle cut and ready to go. I'm going to place this on top once again, right sides touching, and sew this top edge with 1/4 inch of seam allowance. Then I'm going to flip this over towards the batting and then iron that in place. And then I'm going to transfer those notches from our back piece to our front piece, which is a very important step for closure option 2. So I will just put my back piece on top. Notch 1 is going to be right above that batting, so that is a little bit easier. And the next notch is notch 2, which is 1.5 centimeter above that. And then I'm just going to copy that on the other side. And now we can get started to sew the side seams of our main piece, which again is the same for view A and view B. So I'm going to place these pieces on top, and this is where it becomes a little bit more tricky. So we're actually going to sew right until notch 2 and we're going to backstitch there. Then we're going to skip that opening between notch 2 and notch 1, and then we will continue sewing from notch 1 all the way to the bottom edge. Then of course for view A we're going to sew again that base of the rectangle, and then we're going to repeat that same side seam on the other side. If you're making view B, we're of course adding the rectangle base to the bottom as well after sewing the side seams. And we're of course sewing the side seams with 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch of seam allowance. And of course remember to sew until notch number 2. Then just lifting my presser foot up and pulling it down, and then start sewing again at notch 1. And then I always clip the threads that are in between that opening. And then before sewing the lining, I'm just going to do a little bit of top stitching around this little opening for our drawstring. So I'm going to finger press those seams open. And then I'm going to start sewing a box from that top edge. And I'm gonna sew all the way down until that bottom of our opening, which is notch 1. Then with my presser foot down, pivot and turn. And sew just a little bit straight. And then sew back up again. So that's going to look like this, and that's just going to keep those seam allowances just a little bit better in place. And you're going to repeat that for the other side. Then just like we did for the lining, I'm going to finish the corners just by flipping this or pulling this, then putting the seam allowances on top of each other and finger pressing the seam allowance open. And then for the main fabric, I do really like to use a pin, and then actually I like to pin right between both seams so that I can actually see it pop up on the wrong side. So then I know that they're securely on top of each other. And then I'm going to sew this with 1 centimeter seam again. And after sewing the side seams of view B, I'm just going to find that side seam and I'm going to finger press that open. And then I'm going to place that on top one of the notches of our base and then pin that in place. And I'm gonna do the exact same thing for the notch on the opposite side. And then also the notch that we have for each center point. And then I'm going to pin the rest of the bag in place. And then I'm gonna sew around the entire base of the bag with 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch of seam allowance. Now we have our main bag here and also our lining piece that is currently inside out. And then I'm going to put my main bag inside of my lining piece. So right sides are together. And then I'm going to pin those in place at the side seam. Make sure to finger press open all of those seam allowances. And then I'm going to sew around this entire top circumference with 1 centimeter of seam allowance, which is 3/8 inch. And you do want to leave an opening so we're able to turn our bag towards the right side. The bigger you leave the opening, the bigger of a hole you're gonna have. So I'm going to leave an opening about 6 centimeters, which is just a little bit over 2 inches, because I'm making the size extra small. But for the bigger sizes, I do suggest a bigger opening. And then we're going to turn our bag towards the right side through that opening. And first I like to just pull out one of the fabrics, so either the lining fabric or the main fabric, but I always start with pulling out the entire main fabric and then the lining fabric will just follow. Then I'm gonna push that lining on the inside of my bag. And then I'm gonna take this to the ironing board and I'm just going to press that entire top edge, as well as our little opening. And then I'm gonna take this back towards the sewing machine and we're going to edge stitch around that entire top edge to sew this opening closed. Then I'm going to sew 2 lines around the entire circumference. One is going to be right above notch 2 and the other one is going to be right below notch number 2. And that is going to create a casing for our drawstring. And it's going to be around 1.5 centimeters from that top edge. And then that next stitching line is also going to be 1.5 centimeters from the first one. And then here is our bag finish with closure option 2. And now it just needs a drawstring. For this drawstring option, I do like to just use a safety pin because this opening is a little bit smaller. So here I have my drawstring and a safety pin. I will just pin my safety pin through that drawstring. Then I go through that opening and then I will go around the entire circumference until I reach this opening again. And then I'm going to thread the other one through the other opening. So this is the first hack of the pattern that I would like to show you. I'm going to be adding a ruffle all around this top edge. So this is view A, the rectangle, and I have just finished the main bag, so the lining is not attached. And then I've also cut this long piece that I'm going to use for the ruffle. So if you also want to make a ruffle, basically the entire length of this needs to be twice, of course, the front and the back, because we're doing it on the front and the back, times 1.5, because that is what we want to use to gather it and to make it a ruffle. The longer you make it, the more ruffled and gathered it's going to be. As you can see, mine is actually almost like twice the length, so it's going to be a nice big ruffle, which I really like. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to sew the short edges together. So we're going to put these on top of each other, right sides touching, and I'm going to sew this with 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch of seam allowance. Then I'm at the ironing board and I'm just going to press that seam open. Then I'm going to fold this entire ruffle in half. So as you can see right now, it's just one big tunnel. And I'm just going to fold it in half with wrong sides touching, just like this. And then I'm going to press that with my iron. So now we have this long piece that looks the same on both sides. Now we're going to take this to the sewing machine. Then before I gather anything, I always make sure that I have enough thread in my bobbin. Or else if you run out of thread in your bobbin, you're gonna have to do it all over again. Then I like to change my length, like my stitch length, to a long stitch. You can also play around with the tension, but I like to just keep that the same. And then it's very important to not backstitch in the beginning and in the end. And we're just gonna sew around the entire circumference, around 6 millimeters or 1/4 of an inch from the top edge. And we're sewing on the side that is still open. You can add another gathering stitch to make it a little bit easier for yourself, but honestly I always just do one stitch when I'm gathering something and it works fine for me. So I'm gonna take this to the bag and we're gonna gather it together. So here we have the main piece with the right sides facing out. I like to first find the side seam and I am going to finger press it open because that's how we're sewing it for all of the views. Then I'm going to find that side seam of my ruffle piece, which is over here, and I'm just going to pin it in place so that at least those seams are nice and aligned. Then I'm folding that ruffle in half to find the halfway point, placing a pin there, then placing that around the entire bag, and then repeating it on the other side. So then I'm actually going to pin this on the other side seam, right where we pinned the halfway point of our ruffle. So that way you know that the ruffle is evenly divided. So now this is the piece that we're going to gather for the front, and then we have that same amount on the back. So then here we have that long thread from our gathering stitch. I'm just going to pull on one of those threads. So we have an upper thread and a bottom thread. Mine is the top thread that I'm pulling, but you have to pull on one of those. If you're pulling on both, there's nothing's going to happen. So just one of them. And you can see that it's beginning to really gather like a ruffle. And then I just keep gathering it until it fits. So here we have it all gathered up on the back, and then I'm going to repeat that for the front piece. And then we're going to sew around the entire top circumference with 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch of seam allowance, and of course changing back our stitch length to a shorter stitch. Then the next thing that I like to do for the ruffle edition is to just trim down this edge because it is quite thick, and so I just want to remove a little bit of this bulk. And you do have to be really careful to not accidentally cut your stitching that we've just done. And then you can take your closure piece, the little extra fabric bit, and just pin that in place, just making sure that that is nice and centered. And the only thing that I'm doing differently is to just have this overlap a tiny bit because we just trimmed down that seam allowance. And if we are not doing that, then we're making that closure piece longer. You could also trim it to be shorter, of course. Then we're gonna sew around this circumference following our previous stitching that we have here. So I'm facing the wrong side or the inside of my main bag, and then we can insert the lining. So I've just finished sewing the lining, and now I'm just gonna give this a good press with the iron. So first I'm going to iron all of this seam allowance to be flat with the ruffle facing up. And then I'm going to iron my ruffle towards the other side. So it's gonna go down like this. Then we're gonna take the bag to the sewing machine, and we're going to sew alongside the entire top edge over the ruffle, whilst also making sure to close that hole that we used to turn the bag towards the right side. And this seam we are going to sew just a little bit lower because we do have a really thick seam allowance here, so you want to try to avoid sewing over that. And then this is how the top edge will look after sewing. So this is more of a bulky edge, as you can see. You can also see that that seam allowance is, well, from the lining, it's a lot less flat than in the other bags. Like you can see like a bump, but it does create this really cute ruffle effect. Also the opening of the bag is a little bit less neat. You can see I did add a little bit of additional top stitching just to make that a little bit more secure. So these are just some small things to keep in mind for this specific hack, but I think it turned out really cute. Now I'm going to sew the half triangle squares, and I'm doing 2 at a time. So we just marked that line down the center from point to point, and then I'm going to sew right next to that line on both sides with 1/4 of an inch of seam allowance. And then I'm gonna go in the opposite direction of my chain. So I turned this around, and now I'm going to sew on the other side. And then we will take a square like this, and we will cut across our marked line. So there will be 1/2 inch of seam allowance on both sides. And now you can take this to your ironing board, and you can just press open this seam, and then we have some half triangle squares. So I've just finished putting all of my half triangle squares together, forming this pattern. This is a really fun pattern in general, the half triangle squares, because you can basically make any kind of motif. So here I kind of went for these diagonals, diamond shapes that are, yeah, really fun. So then I added a little bit of a bottom piece as well as a top piece in my main fabric. And I'm kind of following the measurement and how to do this for closure option 1. And then I've also added 1.5 inch to the top edge. Next up, I would also like to show you how to use regular batting instead of the fusible batting, because I know not everybody has that available to them. So I'm going to be using this really thick and squishy batting, so it's going to create a nice puffy effect, which actually is really cute as well. So I will just lay that out and then I will place my piece on top. And for this kind of batting, I do like to leave just a little bit of a border around it, because I am going to be quilting this because it's not fusible. If you want it to be fusible, you could also use a glue spray, but I think it's going to be fun to actually quilt this. And then you obviously need to have a front and a back, so this will be my front piece. Then depending on your sewing machine, it is best to put just a backing fabric behind this, so that all of this fluff doesn't get attached to your sewing machine or get stuck anywhere. And then I'm going to be quilting some diagonal lines. I'm just going to kind of follow my pattern that I have going on here. So I'm going to diagonally stitch just like this with a long stitch length. And I'm not going to quilt basically this top edge where we have that extra 1.5 inch, which is about this much. So I'm going to leave that away. And also I don't really want my batting to be there anyways, but I am just going to trim this down a little bit, because that's just going to remove a little bit of the bulk. So I'm going to take this to the sewing machine as well as my back piece. And I'm going to quilt that, and then I will meet you back here. For the next step of the back, we're going to cut our closure piece. So here you do have to measure your actual bag. So here I have my bag and we need to measure the bottom of our base. So I have a measuring tape here. So my base is almost 18 centimeters. And then we have to add 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch to this measurement. And then we're also of course going to need the width of our bag, which for me currently is about 12 inches. And to that measurement we also need to add seam allowance. So for each side seam we're adding 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch of seam allowance. And before taking this to the sewing machine and sewing the side seams, we need to add some notches. So our first notch is going to be 4 centimeters from the top edge. And then the next one is going to be 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch below that. So now it's 6 centimeters from that top edge. And then we need to repeat that on the other side. So I'm going to be sewing this side seam with 3/4 of an inch of seam allowance, which is 2 centimeters. But we want to sew until our notch. Then we want to stop sewing here at the notch. So this is going to be an opening. And then we will sew this bottom edge again. And now we're going to finish these seams. So right now these are still raw edges. So I'm going to be folding those towards the inside. So I'm folding this one in half right up towards that stitching. And then in half again. So I'm folding it by 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch twice. And then I'm going to put this under the sewing machine and sew. And then you're gonna do that for the other side of that opening as well. And then also of course the other side seam. So we're doing this 4 times in total. So once again I'm folding that towards the inside by 1 centimeter and then again. So here's how that will look once it's finished from the inside, and you can see that opening very well. And then after you've done the other side seam as well, we're going to take this to the ironing board. Before I iron the rest, I'm just quickly going to press my seams. And then with the wrong side still facing me, so inside out, we are going to be folding this top edge by 2 centimeters twice, which is 3/4 of an inch. So first I will fold it once by 2 centimeters and iron that. And then I will fold it again. And this fold should then actually overlap our opening. Then you can pin this in place and we will take this to the sewing machine and edge stitch all around this circumference. And you can see here how that looks from the right side. So you can see that my opening is right on top of this fold that we've just made. So here I don't see anything of my opening, but I do on the right side of our work. And then to make sure my opening doesn't rip any further, I do like to just give this a little back stitch so that it's nice and secure. So I will start at that stitching line. And that's going to look like this, and that just stabilized this opening a little bit. And we're going to repeat that for the other side. So now here we have our main bag, our opening, and then we just need to finish our lining. And I just wanted to quickly show you this pocket that I did here for the lining. This is kind of like pocket 3, which is for the outside with the Velcro, but I decided to put that on the inside just because it's fun. And I had some leftovers of my quilt fabric, and then I actually lined that, which is really easy to do. It's just sewing a square on top and leaving an opening and then turning it towards the right side. So this is just a fun little hack that you could do as well. Basically this pattern has limitless options and it's a really fun thing to just play around with. And I think this is going to be super cute once it's on the inside. So now I'm just going to finish sewing my lining and then we can assemble everything together. The lining is now finished and now we can get started to assemble the entire bag. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to fold this leftover fabric that kind of stops at the bedding. We need to fold that twice by 2 centimeters because this is around 4 centimeters. So we're going to fold that twice. And then I always like to finger press open those seam allowances. I'm gonna fold this by 2 centimeters so that edge will hit the bedding. So this is it folded once to the inside and then we're going to fold it again. And now you can see that that will actually overlap the bedding. Then I will place the bag open just like this. And then I'm going to take my lining piece and I'm going to put that on the inside so wrong sides are touching each other. And that lining piece will be shorter actually than our main piece. So that should now be exactly the same length once we folded that top edge. So our lining piece is going to fall right 2 centimeters below that top edge of our main fabric. So I just refold this again. And then I like to temporarily pin this in place. Only just 2, so 1 at each side seam, because we also need to place our closure piece between this. So that opening is now going to look like this. And then we need to finish the closure piece and we're also going to put that between all of these layers of fabric. So here we have the closure piece with the right side out. And I'm going to start with the side seam. Going to just remove that pin real quick and open that fold. And then I'm going to put the closure piece right below that fold with those side seams aligned and then just refold that and place my pin on top. Then I'm going to do the same for the other side. So this is actually the most difficult part of the bag, or this kind of closure option. And we also have to sew through a lot of layers after this. And then I'm just going to divide this leftover fabric. And I am going to start pinning now from that right side of our fabric, because this is going to be a top stitching or a visible stitch. So it is nice to do it with the right sides facing you. Then I'm gonna take this to the sewing machine and then I'm going to sew around this entire top circumference of the bag. So we're actually going to stitch right below this fold. So this is going to be around 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch from the top edge. And finally, I'm going to add some extra decorative stitching. So here I have taken the top piece and just pinned that to the bag. And then I'm going to edge stitch right along this. And then that's going to create a really nice and neat effect on the inside as well. Then I will give this all a final press. And then this closure option of the bag is finished. So here you can see how that will look once we close it up. You just have this extra little fabric detail, so it also creates a little bit more of a spacious bag. You can really fill this one to the top with all kinds of knitting or other things.